It was a profound personal commitment which defined her whole life. She made sacrifices for duty.
Something enormous just happened inside Buckingham Palace, and the royal family is not saying a single word about it. King Charles has made a move that nobody predicted, and Catherine is already stepping into the space Camilla just lost. The shift no one saw coming. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a royal palace when power moves from one hand to another. It is not the silence of mourning or celebration. It is something far more calculated, far more deliberate. And in the case of Buckingham Palace in the early months of 2025, it is the kind of silence that speaks louder than any formal announcement ever could. What is happening right now inside the walls of the British monarchy is not a minor reshuffling of schedules or a gentle rebalancing of duties. It is a structural realignment, and at the center of it is a decision that King Charles III has made that will define the second half of his reign. For months, observers of the royal family noticed something that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Camilla, the Queen, was appearing less frequently at the kinds of engagements that carry the heaviest symbolic weight. The joint appearances with Charles at state-level functions began to feel slightly thinner. The briefings that typically flow from the Queen's office to the press began arriving with less regularity. Insiders who speak to royal correspondents in the background have started using a word that nobody in the palace likes to use out loud: tension. Now, tension inside the British royal family is not exactly headline news. This is an institution that has survived centuries of internal conflict, dynastic warfare, abdications, divorces, and scandals that would have destroyed lesser families and lesser nations. But what makes the current tension different, what makes it worth examining very carefully, is the direction in which it is running. This is not the old tension between Charles and his sons. It is not the familiar friction between the old guard and the next generation. This tension is running directly between the king and his own wife, and it is producing consequences that are now visible to anyone paying close enough attention. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you have to go back and understand what Camilla was given when Charles ascended to the throne in September of 2022. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away after 70 years on the throne, the monarchy entered a period of enormous transition. Charles had waited longer to become king than any heir in British history. He was 73 years old on the day of his accession. He brought with him a lifetime of opinions, commitments, relationships, and yes, a wife whose path to the role of queen had been one of the most complicated, most debated, and most publicly contested journeys in modern royal history. Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, had been at the center of one of the great romantic and reputational storms of the 20th century. Her relationship with Charles during his marriage to Princess Diana had made her one of the most disliked public figures in Britain through the 1990s and well into the 2000s. The public hostility was real, it was fierce, and for a long time, it seemed like it might never fully dissolve. But Charles loved her, had always loved her. And when the two married in April of 2005, the palace began the slow, deliberate work of rehabilitating Camilla's image and integrating her into the fabric of royal life. By the time Charles became king, that rehabilitation project was widely considered a success. Polls showed her approval ratings had climbed substantially. The late queen herself had publicly endorsed Camilla's future role as queen consort. The press had largely softened. And when the coronation took place in May of 2023, Camilla stood at Westminster Abbey in a crown that had been specially prepared for her and was received with warmth that would have been entirely unimaginable a decade earlier. Charles rewarded that journey. He gave Camilla real access, real responsibilities, and a genuine role in shaping how the monarchy presented itself to the world. She had her own patronages, her own offices, her own engagement calendar, and her own growing circle of advisors whose loyalty ran to her rather than to the broader palace machine. For a time, it worked. And then, very gradually, it began to unravel. Camilla's rise and the power she was given. To appreciate the significance of what Charles has now done, you need to understand precisely how much power Camilla had accumulated and how quickly she had learned to use it. Because the story of Camilla's influence inside the palace is not simply the story of a wife standing beside her husband at official functions, It is the story of a woman who understood institutional power with a sophistication that surprised even those who had underestimated her for decades. When Charles became king, the palace faced an immediate structural problem. The institution had for 70 years been built entirely around one woman, Queen Elizabeth II, whose instincts, preferences, and rhythms had shaped everything from how correspondence was handled, to which charities received royal patronage, to how the press was managed. Removing that center of gravity was always going to leave a vacuum, and vacuums inside royal palaces are dangerous things. They get filled one way or another. Camilla moved into that vacuum with a quiet confidence that was remarked upon by people across the palace. She expanded her team. She cultivated relationships with editors and broadcasters who could shape coverage. She positioned herself as the accessible, relatable face of a monarchy that was struggling to find its footing in the post-Elizabethan era. And she did something particularly shrewd. She identified the causes and the engagements that carried the most cultural resonance and attached herself to them with a consistency that began to make her, in the eyes of some observers, the more visible royal of the pair. Camilla's literary interests became a vehicle for genuine public engagement. Her championing of reading, books, and literacy through the Queen's Reading Room and related projects generated warm press coverage and brought her into contact with artists, writers, and cultural figures who then became ambassadors for her image in ways that were difficult to orchestrate deliberately but enormously valuable nonetheless. She was photographed laughing, relaxed, and human. She gave interviews that felt genuinely unguarded. She told stories that made people like her. It was, by any measure, a masterclass in managing a public persona. But here is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the very effectiveness of Camilla's image-building campaign began to create a problem that neither she nor Charles had fully anticipated. The more successfully she positioned herself as a warm and capable royal, the more certain questions arose. Quietly at first, and then with increasing persistence, about the relationship between her public profile and her actual institutional role. There is a difference between being popular and being appropriate. There is a difference between being visible and being authorized. And some of the things that Camilla had begun to involve herself in were starting to brush against lines that the palace had not explicitly drawn, but that everyone inside the institution understood implicitly. The specific nature of those encroachments is something the palace has been extremely careful not to discuss publicly, for the obvious reason that discussing them publicly would require acknowledging that they happened. But multiple reports from royal correspondents over the past year have pointed to friction around Camilla's role in communications decisions, her independent contact with certain government figures, and more pointedly, her relationship with some of the senior household staff, whose primary loyalty should flow upward to the king rather than laterally to the Queen's own office. None of this is unique in the history of royal consorts. What is unique is that Charles, who has spent his entire adult life deferring, waiting, accommodating, and managing, appears to have reached a point where he decided he would no longer do so. There is one more element to this story that cannot be ignored, and it is perhaps the most delicate of all: Charles's health. The king was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024, and while the palace has maintained that his treatment has been progressing well, and that he has returned to public duties, the reality of governing an ancient institution while managing a serious illness is one that inevitably changes a person's relationship with time, with legacy, and with the question of what truly matters. People who have faced serious illness often speak of a new clarity, a willingness to make decisions they had previously deferred, a desire to ensure that the things they have built will survive them in the form they intended. Those who know Charles well suggest that his diagnosis accelerated a reckoning that was already coming, and that the question of Camilla's power was one of the things that reckoning brought into sharp focus.
Then the breaking point. What Charles finally decided. Every significant institutional decision has a moment of crystallization, a point at which accumulated pressures become impossible to manage through the usual means of delay, negotiation, and careful ambiguity. For Charles and Camilla, that moment appears to have arrived in the closing weeks of 2024 and the opening months of 2025. And what emerged from it was a series of changes to Camilla's role that, taken individually, might be explained away as routine adjustments, but taken together, tell a very clear story.
The most significant change involves what royal watchers describe as the inner circle of institutional decision-making. The palace, like any large and complex organization, operates through a hierarchy of briefings, consultations, and sign-offs that determine not just what decisions are made, but who is in the room when they are made. Being in the room is everything. Being removed from the room is a statement that does not require a press release, because everyone inside the institution understands exactly what it means. Camilla had, over the course of Charles's reign, established a presence in several of those rooms. Not all of them, and not always formally, but consistently enough that her perspective was factored into discussions where, strictly speaking, the Queen's perspective was not constitutionally required. That access has now been curtailed. The adjustment was not announced. It was simply enacted quietly through the kind of procedural changes that palace officials can always describe as administrative in nature if anyone asks, which of course nobody in the press is currently in a position to ask directly, because nobody in the press has been told it happened. What has been reported and what has been corroborated by multiple sources speaking to royal journalists is a narrowing of Camilla's independent patronage activity. But through the cumulative weight of who she is and how she shows up, several of the causes and organizations with which she had been most prominently associated have received word through official channels that the nature of the Queen's involvement will be changing going forward. Some have been gently redirected toward coordination with the Princess of Wales's office rather than the Queen's. The framing in each case has been diplomatic and the language carefully chosen, but the message is unmistakable to anyone who speaks fluent palaces. There is also the question of overseas engagements. For the past 2 years, Camilla had been included in the planning conversations for high-profile royal visits abroad, not merely as a participant, but as someone whose preferences shape the itinerary. Sources suggest that the process for upcoming visits has been restructured, with Camilla's office receiving finalized schedules rather than being consulted during their formation. Again, the meaning is unambiguous. Why did Charles make these decisions? The answer that royal watchers keep returning to is the simplest one available. He looked at the institution he had inherited, the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead, and he made a calculation about what it needed to survive and to thrive in the years beyond his own reign. That calculation pointed clearly toward one person, not Camilla, Catherine. The relationship between Charles and his daughter-in-law has always been more complex and more layered than the press tends to portray it. There were difficult years when the tensions between Charles and William spilled over into William and Catherine's relationship with the older generation of the family. But Catherine has, over time, earned something from Charles that is rarer and more valuable than affection. She has earned his respect. And in the specific vocabulary of Charles's emotional world, respect is the currency that actually buys something. Catherine's handling of her own cancer diagnosis and treatment, her measured and dignified return to public duties, and the extraordinary care with which she has rebuilt her public presence have all registered deeply with the king. He sees in her what the late Queen saw in very few people during her own reign, the capacity to carry the weight of the institution without being crushed by it. Catherine's steps, what she has already taken. Over. The phrase stepping in implies a sudden movement, a decisive crossing of a threshold, and in one sense, that is exactly what has happened. But in another, more accurate sense, Catherine's assumption of greater prominence and responsibility has been so carefully prepared, so meticulously staged, that the step itself was made possible by months of groundwork that almost nobody noticed while it was being laid. The patronages. Several of the organizations that had been most closely associated with Camilla's public work have now been formally connected to Catherine's office. The transition has been handled with exquisite care, with public communications framing each change as a natural evolution rather than a transfer. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. Catherine is now the primary point of contact. Catherine's team is setting the agenda, and Catherine's priorities are shaping what those organizations focus on and how they communicate their work to the public. Then there is the question of the children. This may seem like a personal matter rather than an institutional one, but inside the royal family, the two are never fully separable. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis are not merely William and Catherine's children. They are the next chapter of the monarchy's story, and how they are prepared for that story is one of the most consequential decisions being made inside the palace right now. Charles has been increasingly involved in their preparation, in ways that go beyond the purely grandparental and carry a genuine institutional dimension. And Catherine has been the one facilitating that involvement, managing it, and ensuring that it happens on terms that serve the children's well-being, as well as the institution's needs. The result is a relationship between Charles and Catherine that has grown closer and more operationally significant than at any previous point in both their lives. Sources describe conversations between the King and the Princess of Wales that touch on matters of palace management, public engagement strategy, and long-term planning in ways that would have been inconceivable even 3 years ago. Catherine is not merely being consulted, she's being trusted. Her public appearances have reflected this shift with a clarity that anyone watching carefully can observe. The engagements Catherine has taken on since returning to full duties have been chosen with a precision that speaks to deliberate strategic intent. She has focused on causes that carry broad appeal across demographic groups: mental health, early childhood development, community resilience, areas where the monarchy can demonstrate tangible relevance to the lives of ordinary people. She has been visible at exactly the moments when visibility matters most, and has managed to convey, without ever saying so directly, that she is not merely performing the role of Princess of Wales, but inhabiting it completely. The contrast with Camilla's recent public presence is not something the palace has drawn attention to. It doesn't need to. The photographs, the schedules, the press coverage, and the weight of institutional signal all tell the same story, without any need for editorial commentary. Catherine is the center. Catherine is where the momentum is. And Charles, far from discouraging that perception, appears to be actively reinforcing it. There is a deeper dimension to this story that deserves careful attention, because it connects directly to what the monarchy is for and what it needs to be in the decades ahead. The British royal family operates in an environment of profound and accelerating change. The social contracts that once guaranteed automatic deference to hereditary institutions are under pressure everywhere in the democratic world. The monarchy's continued relevance depends not on ceremony alone, but on its ability to embody something that people in ordinary life actually value and recognize: warmth, integrity, presence, continuity. Catherine embodies all of those things in a way that the polling data confirms and that the crowds at her public engagements make viscerally apparent. She connects with people in a manner that is not manufactured or strategic in any superficial sense, but that flows from something genuinely interior, from a set of values and a way of being in the world that registers as authentic even through the distorting lens of media coverage and royal protocol. Charles understands this. He has spent a lifetime watching his own public image struggle against the misalignment between who he is and how he is perceived. He recognizes in Catherine something he never quite had for himself, and he is wise enough to know that the institution is better served by amplifying it than by constraining it. The palace dynamics nobody is talking about. Every time the royal family undergoes a significant internal shift, there is a public story and a private story, and the two are almost never the same. The public story, the one that trickles into royal columns and surfaces on morning television programs, tends to emphasize harmony, continuity, and the ancient rhythms of an institution that has survived everything history has thrown at it. The private story is messier, more human, and considerably more interesting. The private story right now involves 3 separate dynamics that are running simultaneously and interacting with each other in ways that make the overall situation genuinely volatile beneath its polished surface. The first is the dynamic between Charles and Camilla, which, as this script has already explored, has shifted significantly and in ways that carry real emotional weight for both parties. The second is the dynamic between William and Charles, which has been improving but remains fragile and is highly sensitive to anything that could be read as interference or condescension from the older generation. The third is the dynamic between Camilla and Catherine, which is perhaps the most discussed in certain circles and the least understood in public. The relationship between Camilla and Catherine has never been warm in the way that the palace communications team has occasionally tried to suggest. They are fundamentally different people with fundamentally different approaches to the role that royal life requires of them, and those differences have historically created friction rather than complementarity. Camilla is spontaneous where Catherine is considered. Camilla is instinctively social, where Catherine is more private. Camilla's relationship with the press has been built on personal charm and informality. Catherine's relationship with the press has been built on control and careful management. Neither approach is wrong in absolute terms, but the two approaches generate friction when they operate in close proximity and are serving the same institutional master. What has changed in the past several months is that the institutional master has made a choice. Charles's decision to curtail Camilla's independence and elevate Catherine's role is not, at its core, a judgment about who he loves more or who he prefers as a person. It is a judgment about what the monarchy needs. But judgments like that always have personal consequences. But Catherine has, over time, earned something from Charles and the personal consequences in this case are being felt by everyone involved. Those close to Camilla describe a woman who has processed the changes with more grace than might have been expected, but who is not without feelings about what has happened. She did not become Queen Camilla easily. The journey that brought her to Westminster Abbey was long and painful and cost her things she can never get back. To have the practical dimensions of that role quietly reduced is not something any person accepts without a private reckoning. Sources suggest she is confided in a small number of trusted friends, and that the word she has used most consistently is not anger or betrayal, but something closer to resignation. She understands why Charles has done what he has done. That doesn't make it painless. William's position in all of this is one of studied neutrality, which is itself a kind of statement. He has not pushed back against the changes, which is notable because there was a version of this story in which he might have. The version in which William, fiercely protective of Catherine and attuned to anything that could be read as the palace managing his wife's role rather than supporting it, pushed back hard. That version did not materialize, which suggests that the changes were communicated to William in advance and in terms that he found acceptable. It also suggests that Catherine herself is comfortable with the direction of travel, which, given her intelligence and her instincts for institutional self-preservation, seems entirely plausible. There is one more element of the internal dynamic that deserves mention, and it concerns the staff. The palace employs hundreds of people across its various households, and those people are exquisitely sensitive to the movement of institutional favor. They have careers, livelihoods, and professional loyalties that are shaped by their assessments of where power actually sits. Over the past several months, the flow of talented and ambitious staff members toward Catherine's office and away from Camilla's has been noted by multiple observers. Staff do not generally move toward people who are losing ground. They move toward people who are gaining it, and right now, the movement is unmistakably in one direction. What this means for the future of the royal family. Step back far enough, and the story of what is happening right now inside the British royal family becomes something larger than a dispute about patronages and briefings and who is invited into which meetings. It becomes a story about succession, about legacy, and about the fundamental question that every monarch must eventually confront. What do you want your reign to have meant? Charles has been king for just over 2 years. He came to the throne older than any of his predecessors, with more experience, more opinions, and more accumulated wisdom about the institution than any heir in history. He also came to it with a cancer diagnosis that, whatever the official optimism of the palace communications, must concentrate the mind wonderfully on questions of time and priority. What he appears to have decided, with a clarity and a decisiveness that those who have watched him for decades say is new, is that the future of the monarchy runs through William and Catherine, and that his most important task is to ensure that future is as strong as possible. Stripping Camilla of key powers and stepping back from the image of a dual monarchy that had been developing is, in this reading, not an act of marital coldness, but an act of institutional foresight. Charles is clearing the lane. He is ensuring that when the next transition of power comes, whenever it comes, the path from the current reign to the next one is as smooth, as uncontested, and as symbolically clear as possible. He does not want the monarchy's next chapter to begin with questions about competing power centers or residual influence from his own era. He wants it to begin with William on the throne and Catherine beside him, undisputed, unencumbered, and with the full confidence of the institution behind them. Catherine's role in this longer arc is something she herself understands with considerable depth. She is not simply a beneficiary of Charles's decisions. She is, in a meaningful sense, a partner in the strategic project those decisions are serving. The care she has taken in rebuilding her own public presence after illness, the precision with which she has chosen her causes and her timing, the warmth she has shown the king in public appearances where their relationship is on display. These are not accidental. They reflect the work of a woman who understands exactly what this moment requires and who is committed to meeting it fully. The broader public has begun to sense this, even if they cannot always articulate it precisely. The instinct that Catherine is the future, that she is not merely waiting in line, but actively embodying something the monarchy needs now, and will need even more in the years ahead, is one that cuts across the usual divides of age, class, and political opinion. She has achieved something genuinely rare in the history of royal consorts. She has made the case for herself not through argument or assertion, but through the cumulative weight of who she is and how she shows up. That is a kind of power that cannot be assigned by any king, or taken away by any restructuring of palace duties. It belongs entirely to her. What does this mean in practical terms for the monarchy's next decade? It means that the institution will consolidate around William and Catherine with a speed and a completeness that would not have been possible without Charles's deliberate intervention. It means that Camilla will retain the title and the dignity of her position, but will exercise something closer to ceremonial influence than operational power. It means that the British public, which has generally been willing to extend goodwill to Camilla while never quite extending full trust, will over time see less of her in the contexts where institutional authority is most visible. And it means that Catherine, whose own journey to this point has been anything but easy, who has faced public scrutiny of a ferocity that would have broken many people, who spent months of her young life battling an illness while the world speculated wildly about her absence, and who came back from all of it with more grace and more purpose than she had before, is now standing in the center of the stage that history prepared for her. She did not take it by force. She did not scheme for it or demand it. She earned it in the only way that ultimately matters inside an institution as ancient and as watchful as the British crown. She proved over time and under pressure that she was worthy of it. The royal family is changing. It has always changed. Every generation rewrites the terms of what the monarchy means and how it functions. And every rewriting produces winners and losers, insiders and outsiders, those whose moment has passed and those whose moment has finally, decisively arrived. What is happening right now, quietly without press releases or formal announcements, is one of those rewritings. And when the history of this era is eventually written, the chapter that begins in the early months of 2025 will be remembered as the moment when King Charles made his choice, and the future of the British monarchy snapped into focus. The palace never confirms what it cannot deny, but the signs are everywhere for those willing to read them. Charles has chosen the future, and that future has Catherine's name on it. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, because this is only the beginning.